What's more effective against an aggressive bear? A firearm or bear spray? Let's look at what the data says and piss everybody off.
They make noise when I get the food.
So if you spend time in the North American wilderness, you might be in areas where you have to contend with black bears, grizzly bears or brown bears, and polar bears. I know I've certainly done my time in regions that have had all three kinds of bears on long. And of course, ending up inside a bear's stomach is not the way that most people want to go. So you want to keep yourself safe. Now, what do? Obviously, there's all kinds of precautions you're going to take to avoid running into trouble with bears in the first place. You're going to keep your campsite super clean. You're not going to camp in areas where bears expect food. You're not going to take food into your tent. I'm going to take those for granted. Many bear encounters can be prevented long before they ever get started. But what is more effective if push really comes to shove and you've got an aggressive bear coming at you? Now, depending on the situation, I'll carry a firearm, I'll carry bear spray, and there have been times that I've carried both. But what does the data say? I mean, I have my anecdotes. I have my stories of running into bears and dealing with them and diffusing the situation. I'm still here. I'm not inside some bear's stomach, which is great. But my anecdotes are individual. Anecdotes are the lowest form of data. It's just like a doctor saying, I've seen this. That's great. That's interesting. But an anecdote is not really data. Let's take a look at the data. And whenever one considers data, you have to consider the source and potential ideological or political biases of that source. For example, and here's where I'm going to begin to piss people off, if the NRA published a study on firearm versus bear spray efficacy, you'd have to take that study with a giant grain of salt. Similarly, if the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, published a study on this, you'd also have to take that with a giant grain of salt. There are deep-rooted financial, political, and ideological motivations embedded into those organizations in particular that would perhaps skew the data in other ways. So what I've got here are 4 reports and studies published by relatively unbiased sources, and we're going to go through it and pick out the key points and see if there's a theme here. As always, I try to be data-driven. I try to be data-driven in most of my life, and if you come across studies, now studies are not opinions, I'm open to hearing your opinions too, but if you come across studies and data on this, please send them to me. I'm always interested in data, and I've changed my mind many times based on data. So the first of these 4 documents is a single-page document published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in 2002, I believe. And it's titled Bear Spray versus Bullets, which offers better protection. And I'll definitely link to this in the post that I'm going to put on essentialwilderness.com and on the various other video channels that allow links to be posted. This is not a study at all. This is a report. But we'll take a look at it and see what it says, and we've got to treat this one with a grain of salt, and you'll see why. So in this report, they claim, let me read this out loud, based on investigations of human bear encounters since 1992, persons encountering grizzlies and defending themselves with firearms suffer injury about 50% of the time. During that same period, persons defending themselves with pepper spray escaped injury most of the time, and those that were injured experienced shorter duration attacks and less severe injuries. Now, that's interesting, but where's the data? Where is the reports of what actually happened? Where is the methodology that they use to pick some reports, discard other reports? Where's the methodology of how they analyze this? So the very first piece of data, bear spray versus bullets, published by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2002, suggests that bear spray is more effective against grizzlies than firearms, but you wouldn't want to hang your hat on this. So that's study number 1. Let's look at study number 2. And actually, again, this is more properly called a report. This is Bear Spray or Bullets by Lynn Dickerson, bear education technician who at the time worked at the Island Park Ranger Station in Idaho. So bear education technician, presumably they know a lot about bears. So they repeat the claim made in the previous report. According to U.S. Fish and Wildlife law enforcement personnel, even experienced hunters who used firearms to defend themselves suffer injury 50% of the time. Persons defending themselves with bear spray escaped injury most of the time, and those that were injured experienced shorter attacks and less severe injuries. So that's just reporting what we had here. So that's not new information. Then they cite another source of information. Bear spray has been shown to be more effective than a bullet in diverting or stopping a charging bear, according to the Center for Wildlife Information in Missoula, Montana. Okay, that's interesting, but again, there's no link. Where's the data? How do they get the data? Has been shown to is a great statement, but I would like to see the data behind that. So now we've got two sources. We've got the U.S. Fish and Wildlife saying, based on their data, which they don't show us, people using bear spray were injured less often than people using firearms when encountering an aggressive bear. Interesting, not conclusive. And we've got a report of a report saying the Center for Wildlife Information in Missoula, Montana says that bear spray has been found to be more effective than firearms in stopping or diverting a charging bear. Again, interesting, but not at all conclusive. Show me the data. Maybe it's out there. If you know how to get your hands on that data, let me know. I would love to review it on my Essential Wilderness channel. So now we're getting to the more stringent studies. This was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management. Now, I had the good fortune to spend a fair bit of time in the belly of the scientific beast, which means I have some understanding of the process of scientific publication. So when people like me when someone tells you this was published in a journal, that's a little bit more credible than, hey, I saw this newspaper article. Hey, I saw this opinion piece. Hey, I read this blog post. Hey, it's a lot more credible than, hey, I saw this YouTube video, and a lot more credible than, hey, I saw this Facebook post. A journal, in scientific terms, has very stringent standards. It has methodologies that have to be followed. It has to be laid out in certain ways. You have to essentially show your work. Remember high school? Show your work? Yeah, you definitely have to do that in these studies. That makes it easier for people to take a look at it and go, dude, you totally biased the data by leaving this out, or by including this, or by doing this incorrect statistical analysis. And then it gets peer reviewed. So in general, peer reviewed data published in good quality journals is more reliable than something that somebody wrote. It's more reliable than those two reports. So this was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 2006 by Smith, Herrero, De Bruyn, and Wilder. And these are people who worked at the Brigham Young University, University of Calgary, the National Park Service, and the Mineral Management Service. I don't know why the Mineral Management Service got involved, but here we are. And there's some really interesting tidbits in this. This article is called The Efficacy of Bear Deterrent Spray in Alaska. Again, I'll link to it in Essential Wilderness in the article that goes with this video, and I'll link to it in platforms like YouTube where I can actually post links. So as a standard, they have an abstract, which is a very short contraction. This is the Cole's notes of the article, then they have a long introduction. And now we get into the methods. So what did they do? They looked at bear spray incidents from 1985 to 2006 in Alaska using a variety of sources. They ended up with analyzing 83 cases involving the use of bear spray in Alaska, of which 72 incidents involved spraying menacing bears, and the remainder are examples of spray misuse or bear attraction to residue. They address the instances of bear spray misuse separately. So they analyzed the data and looked at it by category. They analyzed it by bear species, so black bear, brown or grizzly bear, and polar bear. So this is interesting because I've been in polar bear country, but I hadn't read of anyone testing bear spray against polar bears up to this point. They looked at whether the bears were acting in a curious manner or in an aggressive manner. They looked at whether the bears were looking for food or whether this was non-food behavior. So they were able to get fairly granular about what the background story was. And this is important. We defined successful outcomes as bear spray having stopped the undesirable behavior of a bear. A bear that no longer pursues a person, breaks off attack, abandons attempt to acquire food or garbage, or turns and leaves the area are examples of successful outcomes. So they basically were talking about bears that were doing things that they shouldn't, And did the bear spray stop that bear from doing what it shouldn't? If it was charging, did it stop the charge? If it was poking around camp, did it drive it away? If it was poking around a cabin, did it drive it away? And they looked at a wide variety of incidents. They looked at hikers. They looked at people who were doing bear management. They looked at people in their cabins, people in their tents. They looked at outdoor workers, sport fishers, hunters, and photographers. What they found is that in 85% of the incidents, bear spray stopped the bear's behavior, and in 15% of the time, the outcome was unclear due to confounding factors, like the bear being trapped in a structure, being unable to flee, or it was unclear whether spraying the bear and the bear stopping doing the annoying behavior there was a clear linkage. So I think that's some intellectual honesty, because, I mean, if you spray a bear in a cabin and the bear doesn't know which way to get out of the cabin, did that work? Did that not work? So they classified that separately. Still, 85% of the time, that's pretty good for a $35 can of bear spray. Of special interest to me, in both polar bear incidents, so they only had 2 polar bear incidents, subadult bears approached humans in a pickup truck there to observe bears feeding on a bowhead whale that was near a village. So in both the polar bear incidents, a whale had washed up on the beach and the bears were eating it, and people went up to watch the bears, and then the bear got aggressive. In both instances of the polar bear attacks, bear spray stopped the bear's approach and turned the bear away. Neither of these bears returned to the truck following the spraying. So that's pretty good. They found that it worked against black bears, brown bears, and polar bears. So this next bit is interesting because a lot of people, myself included, are worried about bear spray in windy environments. What if the wind just blows the spray away? So they found that only in 7% of incidents, wind was reported to have interfered with spray accuracy, although it reached the bear in all cases. They go to say later that most of the reports they had were from wooded or shrubby areas, and that probably mitigated the wind. The wind might be quite high, 40 feet above the ground, but down in the trees, down in the bushes, there's going to be much less wind. So I think one of the limitations of this particular study is if you spend a lot of time in alpine tundra or in Arctic tundra, where the winds can be just ferocious and there's not the shrubbery or the trees to break the wind, I would rely, and I have relied, a little bit less on bear spray in those situations. I'll still carry it, but am I going to be able to use it? I would guess very roughly 50% of the time it's just going to be too windy. What about the times that bear spray didn't work? Out of 175 incidents, 3 people, which is less than 2%, suffered injury by bears that had been sprayed with Bear Deterrent. So they sprayed the bear and they still got injured. Out of 175 cases, 3 people still got injured. One person halted the bear by spraying it at close range in the face, and the other 2 persons were unable to spray a second dose because the initial attack knocked the spray canister from their hands. Nonetheless, only 3 people reported the spray had failed to protect them. No mechanical failures of spray canisters were reported in the 71 cases of use. So that's encouraging. Bear spray works, but we have to compare it to the other alternative, don't we? Which is firearms. Because we have to know, do firearms work? And I'm guessing we all know that they work, but how well do they work relative to these numbers? So just to finish up, I'm going to read the management implications, which is the last section that they have here, because this is the Journal of Wildlife Management, where they're trying to balance the different pressures on wildlife. They're trying to balance hunting and animals roaming free. They're trying to balance animals getting killed on the road, and trying to make sure that there are enough animals left that we can hunt, that we can watch them in the wild, and that they can go on happily as a species. So, this is how they summarize it. Our research shows bear spray deterrent was an effective tool for diffusing bear-human conflict in a non-lethal manner. In Alaska, bear spray was highly effective in dealing with all 3 species of North American bears, although more data on polar bear response is needed, because there were only 2 incidents, right? Persons working and recreating in bear habitat should feel confident that they are safe if carrying bear spray. Although bear spray was 92% effective by our definition of success, it is important to note that 98% of people carrying it were uninjured after a close encounter with bears. So to summarize, in Alaska, in Alaska, which has got some pretty mean bears of all three species of North American bear, bear spray was upwards of 90% effective in diffusing a bear situation and resolving it relatively peacefully. And nobody got killed who was using bear spray. That's good. Nobody ended up as dinner. All right, final study. Again, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management. The Efficacy of Firearms for Bear Deterrence in Alaska. This was conducted by Tony Smith, Stephen Herrero, who was in the last paper, Callie Strong-Layton, Randy T. Larson, and Catherine R. Johnson, and it was published in 2012. Meaning that the data, because publication is a long process as the journal has to go through it and get it peer-reviewed, the data was collected from 2010 and earlier. It's not just, hey, I've got an idea, let me publish in a journal. No, a journal publication is actually a pretty arduous process, and writing these damn papers is the part of the work that every scientist hates. So, what did they do? They looked at 269 incidents of bear-human conflict in Alaska. They went to different sources and compiled it all in a database from the years 1883 to 2009. So that's a lot of bear encounters. Again, it included polar bears, black bears, and grizzly bears, and unidentified bears, meaning that the person wasn't sure. Now they looked at and sorted this data by a ton of variables, like just a ridiculous number of variables. Time, date, month, location of incident, number of people, the sex of the people, activity at the time of interaction, whether or not the bear charged, whether it was fish or game meat around, the type of firearm, the number of shots fired, whether a long rifle or a short handgun, what the kind of habitat was, on and on and on. So they were very detailed, and they kept a very detailed account of all of those details. We deemed the use of a firearm successful when it stopped the offensive behavior of the bear. These successes included incidents where the bear no longer pursued a person, broke off an attack, abandoned attempts to acquire food or garbage, were killed, or left the area as a result of firearms use. So, very roughly equivalent to the success parameters of the bear spray study that I talked about earlier. That was published about 6 years prior to this one getting published. In the results, a total of 444 people were involved in 269 incidents. Now that's data. My story about what I did with threatened by a bear one time in northern Manitoba or one time in Nunavut, those are anecdotes. Put enough of them together and be rigorous about it, you end up with data. So 444 people, 269 incidents, 300 brown bears or grizzly bears, 36 black bears, 6 polar bears, and 15 bears of unknown species. So the first interesting finding is the success rate by firearm type was similar, with 84% of handgun users and 76% of long gun users successfully defending themselves from aggressive bears. Again, that's defined as killing the bear or driving it off or just getting it to stop the offensive behavior. So as you recall, bear spray was upwards of 90%. Here they're finding success rates of 76 to 84. Still pretty high. We'll call it 80% for easy math. We're looking at 80% versus 90%. 80% with firearms, 90% with bear spray. This is interesting. Firearms fail to protect people for a variety of reasons, including lack of time to respond to a bear, which would be the same thing for bear spray and firearms. Mechanical issues like jamming. You could conceivably have that with bear spray as well, although, as I showed in a previous video, bear spray is pretty damn reliable. The proximity to bear was too close for deployment. The proximity to deployment is, I think, where bear spray shines. I mean, if a bear was right here by my head, and I took this bear spray and I sprayed it the opposite direction, yeah, it would douse me, but it would also douse the bear. I could pretty much fire this in all directions. Whereas I'm got a shotgun and the bear's right by my head, I might be able to make noise, and it might get scared off by the noise, but my odds of shooting it behind my head, unless I'm John Bloody Wick, are pretty slim. And to be fair, John Wick once killed 3 bears with a highlighter. This is interesting. When the animal involved in the incident was a black bear, odds of firearm success were more than 38 times greater than when a bear was a polar bear, brown bear, or unknown bear. So that just goes to show how incredibly tough a polar bear is and how incredibly tough a brown bear or a grizzly bear is. I mean, basically, if you're trying to shoot a charging bear, you've got this giant triangle of heavy bone charging towards you. And say you hit it square in the forehead, the odds of that bullet bouncing off that sloping, thick bone surface are reasonably high. So again, with this, doesn't much matter. It goes to the eyes, goes to the nose, and they begin to choke. Similarly, females without young were associated with nearly a 7-fold increase of odds of firearm success. This goes to confirm something that we pretty much all know, which is that a bear mother with a young cub is much, much more determined and much more dangerous than a bear mother without a cub. And finally, once a bear charged, odds of firearm success decreased nearly 7-fold. And I'm going to come back to that in the wrap-up. One final interesting point, firearm type was essentially unimportant, which suggested the efficacy of the firearm was unrelated to whether people used a handgun or a long gun. Considering the high intensity, rapidly unfolding, close quarters, and chaotic nature of bear attacks, these results are not surprising. Hence, we cannot recommend one kind of weapon over another. We did not have the data regarding the level of expertise associated with those who carried the firearms. Regardless, a person's skill level plays an influential role in determining the outcome of bear firearm incidents. There are management implications. No one should enter bear country without a deterrent, and they include both firearms and bear spray as deterrents. And these results show that firearms are not a clear choice. We encourage all persons with or without firearms to consider carrying a non-lethal deterrent such as bear spray, because its success rate under a variety of situations has been greater than those we observe for firearms. So the bear spray was 90% effective for all 3 North American species of bear. All right, so to sum up these 2 reports and these 2 actual studies that were published in an actual journal, I'm going to inject some of my own commentary, well, more than I've been doing already, and give some of my opinions. A lot of people vastly overestimate the efficacy of firearms. They are very effective, for sure. But just as 90% of people think that they're above average intelligence and 80% of Frenchmen think that they're above average lovers, not everyone is an above average shot. And in the chaotic and random environment of a bear encounter, it can be really tough to get off a good shot. I mean, I had to contemplate killing a bear once, and I was standing in the middle of a whitewater rapid, holding a boat with one hand, and had a bear mother, a bear that had a cub, threatening to charge across like a 20-foot stretch of water. You might be great at the range under controlled circumstances. Now try being pinpoint accurate when you're standing in the middle of whitewater, holding a canoe with one hand, and dealing with a very angry bear mother who's 20 feet away. In that case, I used the gun as a noisemaker, and you know what? It didn't work. Bear didn't flinch. Bear eventually decided to go away, but it was on her own terms. And I didn't have bear spray. In that moment, I would have loved to have had bear spray. There's really no evidence for bear spray making bears angry when it doesn't work. So that's important as well. The downside of hitting a bear with bear spray seems to be, based on the data that we have, not very much. There really isn't much of a downside of using bear spray on a bear, other than potentially hitting yourself or the wind carrying it back against you, which has happened to me as well, and it's pretty awful. So having dove into this data, is it going to change my behavior? A little. I am now way more confident that this could potentially save my ass, especially in areas where the wind isn't going to be a huge consideration. If I'm in the forest, if I'm in the shrubs, if there's lots of greenery around, stuff to break the wind, then yes, I would be fairly confident with bear spray. On the other hand, if I was in the tundra, either the alpine tundra at the top of a mountain or the Arctic tundra north of the tree line, I would still carry this. Would I trust it as much? No, because about half the days there's going to be so much wind that you can't deploy it for 180 degrees of your radius. If the wind's coming this way and the bear's up there, I'm just going to be spraying myself. It would work great if the bear's down here somewhere. I could use it from a mile away. I could fire it off and let the wind carry it down to the bear. But it does limit somewhat the range of circumstances where I could use the bear spray. So in an alpine tundra or an arctic tundra or just a large area where there's open land, I don't know if I'm managing an airport in Alaska ever in my life, I would maybe trust this a little bit less. Will I carry a shotgun? It depends. It's actually a bit of a relief because these things are heavy. And when you include the ammunition for them, it makes it heavier yet. And they're expensive. So, am I going to keep my 12 gauge? Absolutely. Am I going to take it with me? Sometimes. I'm more likely to take it with me in areas where there's going to be heavy wind, and I'm going to try and pair these things together. As always, I'm interested in your opinions, but I'm especially interested in your data. Are you aware of any other studies from reputable sources that talk about the relative efficacy of bear spray versus firearms? Let me know.